Chocolate. It's a word that conjures pleasure, warmth, and comfort. From birthday cakes and Valentine's Day boxes to hot cocoa on cold mornings, it's a symbol of celebration, of affection, of indulgence. It lives in our memories, our rituals, our gifts of love. It is joy packaged and sold. But behind the sweetness, behind the glossy wrappers and supermarket shelves, lies a bitter, unspoken truth, one that has been carefully obscured for decades. The truth is this: much of the world's chocolate is made possible by slave labor. Real present-day child-driven systemic exploitation. And most of us have been complicit, unknowingly indulging in a global lie. To uncover this lie, we must go back not just to the factories and supply chains of today, but to the very heart of the industry. A journey that begins not in Switzerland or Belgium, but in West Africa. The Ivory Coast and Ghana produce over 60% of the world's cocoa. These countries are the lungs of the chocolate industry, lush green and sun-drenched. But the wealth they generate does not stay in the soil. It flows outward to European traders, multinational corporations, and billion-dollar brands that line our stores. Nestlé, Hershey, Mars, Ferrero Mondelez. These companies built empires on cocoa, yet the people who harvest the beans, the essential first link in the supply chain, live in deep generational poverty. In the rural outskirts of Subré, a major cocoa-producing region of the Ivory Coast, children wake before dawn. Many are not going to school. Instead, they walk into the forest machetes in hand barefoot or in flip-flops to begin their day's labor. They climb trees. They cut pods. They carry sacks heavier than their own weight. Some are no older than 10, others younger. Many were trafficked, lured from neighboring countries like Mali or Burkina Faso, promised work and wages, only to be sold into invisible servitude. Their names vanish, their stories go unheard, but their labor feeds a global appetite for sweetness. This is not hyperbole, this is not metaphor. This is the lived reality of tens of thousands of children working in dangerous, often illegal conditions. Some are beaten, many are injured, few ever escape, and even fewer are seen. Because the industry that profits from their toil has spent decades mastering the art of plausible deniability. Cocoa farming in West Africa is fragmented. Smallholder farmers, often operating on 1 or 2 hectares of land, are the backbone of production. These farmers live on less than $1 a day. They do not set prices. They do not control the market. They sell to local buyers, who sell to exporters, who sell to chocolate companies. At each level, the price rises. By the time the cocoa bean becomes a chocolate bar, the farmer receives less than 6% of the final retail price. The child who carried the sack, nothing. The corporations at the top, multinational, faceless, powerful, claim they have no direct control over these farms. We do not own the land, they say. We do not hire the labor. But this is a lie of omission, because while they may not hold the deeds, they shape every part of the system. They set the demand. They influence the price. They write the contracts. They control the flow of money, information, and accountability. And they've known about this problem for decades. As early as the late 1990s, journalists and activists began reporting on child labor in cocoa farming. In 2000, a BBC documentary exposed graphic footage of young boys trafficked across borders working with machetes on plantations in the Ivory Coast. The backlash was immediate. Consumers were outraged. Politicians took notice. In 2001, the US Congress proposed the Harkin-Engel Protocol legislation that would have forced companies to certify their chocolate as slave labor-free. The industry panicked. So instead of accepting regulation, they lobbied for a compromise. The result, a voluntary agreement, a promise to end the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa industry by 2005. That deadline passed. They asked for more time. 2008, then 2010, then 2020. Every promise was broken. Every report showed the problem had not been solved, only rebranded, hidden, pushed further into the margins. Behind the scenes, corporations poured money into PR campaigns. They launched sustainability programs with vague names like Cocoa Life and Cocoa Plan. They partnered with NGOs and sponsored conferences. They issued glossy reports filled with smiling children, training sessions, and impact metrics. But on the ground, little changed. In 2019, a US Department of Labor-funded study found that over 1.5 million children were still engaged in hazardous cocoa farming in Ghana and Ivory Coast, not just working alongside their parents, but performing dangerous tasks under coercion, with no schooling, no pay, and no choice. The percentage had barely moved in 20 years, and yet the chocolate kept flowing. Halloween came and went. Valentine's Day sales soared. Super Bowl commercials aired. Consumers seduced by branding forgot. The industry counted on that, but some did not forget. Activists like Terry Collingsworth, a human rights attorney, filed lawsuits against Nestlé and Cargill in the United States on behalf of former child slaves. The cases argued that the corporations knowingly benefited from forced labor, even if they didn't directly employ the children. The legal battle raged for years. In 2021, the US Supreme Court dismissed the case not on the merits, but on jurisdictional grounds. Nestlé and Cargill were not held accountable. The victims remained invisible, and the companies, they celebrated quietly. They knew what that ruling meant, that the system they had built, a supply chain so complex, so opaque, so fragmented, could shield them from consequence, that they could continue business as usual behind the smokescreen of sustainability. But what does sustainability mean when a system is built on exploitation? What does ethical sourcing mean when the source cannot read or write, cannot vote, cannot escape? The truth is, the chocolate industry has perfected a two-tiered reality. One for the West of indulgent celebration and emotion, and one for the rest of poverty, silence, and labor. The cocoa fields of Africa feed the sweet tooth of the world, but they are fields soaked in stolen childhoods. Still, the industry offers hope, not through action, but through language. They promise traceability, transparency, accountability. They say they're working towards solutions. They say it's complicated. And yes, it is complicated. But complexity should never be an excuse for abuse. And in this case, complexity is not natural, it's engineered. Because traceability exists when companies want it to. Barcodes, GPS, blockchain, all are used when it benefits profits. But when it comes to tracing cocoa back to a specific farm, the data goes dark. Why? Because keeping it dark protects the illusion. The illusion that slavery is a relic, not a reality, and yet it is real. So very real. In the shadows of the forest, a boy slices open a cocoa pod. His hands are calloused. His shirt is torn. He doesn't know what chocolate tastes like. He's never seen a Kit Kat or a Snickers. He has no idea that the beans he harvests travel thousands of miles to factories in Europe, are melted and molded into bars wrapped in shiny foil, and sold to children who will never know his name. All he knows is that he must work, that he cannot leave, that this is his life. That boy is not alone. He is one of millions. This is the foundation of the modern chocolate empire. This is the hidden cost of sweetness. This is the story we were never meant to know. But now we know. To trace that path is to understand how the chocolate industry operates, not just as an economy, but as a system of denial. It starts in the farms. Most cocoa in the Ivory Coast and Ghana is produced by smallholders, farmers with 1 to 3 hectares of land. These farmers are in essence independent, but in truth they operate under immense pressure to meet quotas, satisfy intermediaries, and feed their families on the slimmest of margins. Because they are paid a fraction of global market prices, they must maximize yield, minimize costs, and harvest as much as possible in short windows of time. And for that, many turn to the cheapest labor available: children. Once harvested, cocoa beans are fermented, dried, and packed into burlap sacks. Here is where the first stage of opacity begins. The beans are collected by local buyers known as pisteurs in French-speaking regions, who purchase them in bulk from numerous small farms. These buyers in turn sell to cooperatives or directly to exporters. By the time the beans arrive at the port, their origins have already been erased. A sack of cocoa from a trafficked child's farm looks identical to one from a certified operation. There is no barcode, no ledger, just beans. And so the lie begins to scale. Exporters consolidate shipments, file customs declarations, and sell cocoa to major commodity traders, Barry Callebaut, Cargill, Olam, Ecom. These traders are massive global entities, quiet titans of the food world. They roast, grind, and process cocoa into liquor butter and powder. They operate multi-million-dollar facilities and move product across oceans. And they are the middlemen that connect African fields to Western brands. It is these traders who sell processed cocoa to the likes of Nestlé, Mars, Hershey, Ferrero, and Mondelez. And it is these same traders who sign contracts that pledge sustainability, human rights compliance, and child labor-free certification. But how can they make such pledges when they cannot trace the beans? This is where the fiction of certification enters the story. In theory, certification bodies like Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance, and UTZ exist to guarantee that cocoa is sourced ethically. They establish standards, conduct audits, and issue seals that assure consumers their chocolate was produced without harm. In practice, these labels are often cosmetic. Investigations have shown that certified cocoa farms still use child labor. Some certified cooperatives purchase beans from non-certified farms. Audits are sporadic, often announced in advance, and sometimes carried out by local agents with conflicts of interest. There are simply too many farms, too few inspectors, and too many financial incentives to look the other way. Worse, some certifications are self-policed. Corporations pay fees, create internal compliance departments, and publish reports with glossy infographics and smiling farmers. They announce new traceability technologies, blockchain mobile tracking, satellite verification. But on the ground, none of these tools prevent a child from being trafficked or forced to wield a machete. Why? Because these tools aren't designed for protection, they're designed for plausible deniability. Nestlé, for example, has pledged that by 2030, all cocoa in its supply chain will be fully traceable and free from child labor, a noble goal. But this same pledge has been made in different forms since 2001, and every time the deadline draws near, it is quietly extended, reframed, or buried beneath new branding. Why not act faster? Because traceability threatens profit. If a company could truly trace every bean to its source, it would have to confront the reality of its labor practices. It would have to pay farmers more. It would have to restructure the entire supply chain. It would have to admit that the price of cheap chocolate is far higher than anyone wants to admit. And so the system persists, a chain built on silence. But not everyone is silent. In 2019, the Washington Post conducted a rare on-the-ground investigation. Journalists visited cocoa farms in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, interviewing children who admitted they had never been to school, who worked full days carrying pods and clearing brush. The farms supplied major brands. The journalists contacted the companies. The responses were predictable. The companies could not confirm if those specific beans entered their supply chain. But they took the issue seriously. They were investing in solutions. They were committed to ending child labor. The script by now is familiar. Meanwhile, independent watchdogs and non-profits continued to publish data: the 1.56 million children still working in cocoa, the increased rates of hazardous labor, the rise in cross-border trafficking. Each report a reminder that the promises of the past 20 years have amounted to little more than well-funded public relations. Still, some voices grow louder. Activists have begun demanding mandatory due diligence laws legislation that would require companies to actively prevent human rights abuses in their supply chains, not just react after exposure. The European Union is currently debating such regulations. If passed, they could force corporations to map their suppliers, audit them regularly, and face legal consequences for failing to act. But progress is slow. Lobbying is fierce. Chocolate giants argue that they are trying, that the issue is complex, that blame should be shared. They warn of increased costs, disrupted trade, and unintended consequences. In truth, they are protecting the model that has made chocolate so cheap, so abundant, so profitable. Because every time a consumer buys a $1 chocolate bar, someone somewhere pays the price. And that someone is rarely the brand. It is the child in the field, the farmer in debt, the laborer with calloused hands and an empty plate. The most haunting aspect of this system is how effectively it hides itself. Most consumers don't think of slavery when they buy a chocolate bar. They think of sweetness, nostalgia, comfort. They see ads with families' holidays and heartwarming music. They do not see the boy who carried the sack, the girl who never went to school, the forest stripped bare for monoculture. But the system sees them. It counts on their ignorance. It profits from their disconnection. And so the cycle continues. The cocoa bean is roasted, ground, conched, and tempered. Sugar and milk are added. The mixture is molded, cooled, and wrapped. It is shipped to Europe, to America, to Asia. It is displayed in perfect rows under soft lighting next to smiling logos and colorful packaging. And it is sold not just as a product, but as a story, a feeling, a memory. No one talks about where it came from. The global chocolate industry, worth over $130 billion, is not just built on beans and sugar, but on branding. It is a product that sells emotion, childhood nostalgia, luxury indulgence, romantic affection. We are not just buying a chocolate bar. We are buying the idea of joy. And the industry understands that to protect this idea, they must protect the brand at all costs. Let's begin with advertising. Chocolate companies have long understood the power of emotional marketing. In the West, their commercials often feature children laughing, couples embracing, parents bonding. There's music light, happy, heartwarming. There's color, warm, inviting, joyful. There is no blood, no dirt, no forests, no children with machetes. In a world saturated with marketing, the chocolate industry has mastered subtlety. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It tells stories that bypass our logic and go straight to our emotions. And those stories matter. In 2001, as the Harkin-Engel Protocol was introduced and the threat of regulation loomed, chocolate companies launched some of the most aggressive public relations campaigns in the industry's history. They didn't just deny the allegations, they reframed the entire narrative. They created new departments: corporate social responsibility, global cocoa sustainability, ethical sourcing. They hired former diplomats, public health experts, and PR strategists. They partnered with respected NGOs. They hosted cocoa sustainability summits in Geneva and New York, and they issued statements, hundreds of them. These statements almost always followed the same script. We take these allegations seriously. We are deeply committed to ending child labor. We are working with local partners to implement change. We believe in continuous improvement. But beneath the polished language, something darker was unfolding: the systematic neutralization of dissent. Whistleblowers within the industry, employees who tried to sound alarms about child labor, fraudulent audits, and unethical sourcing, found themselves silenced. Contracts were terminated, careers destroyed. In some cases, lawsuits followed. Companies cited defamation. They sought damages. They made examples. One former employee of a major chocolate brand told investigators under condition of anonymity that internal discussions of child labor were strategically avoided. Everyone knew, he said, but it was considered unmanageable. So we focused on PR instead. Another NGO worker described how partnerships with chocolate companies often came with conditions, limits on what could be reported, how findings were framed, and when results were shared. This is not accountability. It is image management, and nowhere is that more evident than in the language of shared responsibility. It is a phrase that appears in nearly every public statement from the chocolate industry regarding labor abuse. The idea is that child labor is not the fault of companies, but the result of poverty, poor governance, lack of education, and cultural norms. It is, they say, a complex issue, one that requires all stakeholders, governments, NGOs, consumers, and communities to work together. This framing is not accidental. It disperses blame, delays action, and shifts focus away from the one entity with the most power to affect change: the buyer. Because chocolate companies are not passive observers of this supply chain. They are its architects. They dictate price. They write contracts. They set delivery terms. They determine which farms survive and which go bankrupt. And they do all of this with full knowledge of the human cost. Yet they continue to invoke complexity as a shield. And when complexity isn't enough, they lean on philanthropy. The chocolate industry has donated millions of dollars to education programs in cocoa-producing regions. They've built schools, funded community centers, and distributed books. At first glance, this seems noble. But dig deeper, and you discover that these acts are often more about optics than outcomes. Many of these schools are understaffed. Some are empty. Others were constructed as photo ops, completed just enough for a ribbon-cutting ceremony before being forgotten. In some regions, chocolate companies publicly announced school-building campaigns, only to quietly abandon them after the media cycle moved on. Even when these programs succeed, they fail to address the core problem: the poverty of cocoa farmers. A family living on less than $1 a day cannot afford to send their children to school, even if the school is next door. They need labor. They need help. And until that dynamic changes, the cycle of exploitation will continue. But raising the price paid to farmers would cut into profits. And so instead, companies tinker with optics. This manipulation isn't limited to farms and schools. It extends into the realm of consumer engagement. In recent years, brands like Nestlé, Mars, and Hershey have launched ethical or bean-to-bar chocolate lines products that promise transparency, traceability, and fair labor. They are marketed as premium responsible choices for the conscious consumer. But these lines often represent a fraction of the company's total output, sometimes less than 5%. The rest of their products continue to rely on the same opaque systems, the same intermediaries, the same silence. The ethical chocolate bar becomes a decoy, a fig leaf, a way to deflect criticism without changing the core business model. And yet these bars sell, because consumers desperate for a clean conscience are eager to believe. This is the genius of chocolate's machinery of denial. It weaponizes hope. It tells us that buying the right bar, supporting the right brand, reading the right label is enough. That change can be consumer-driven, gradual, market-based. But the truth is, this system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. It was built to hide exploitation, to normalize it, to launder it through supply chain certifications and marketing until even the most horrific abuses look like unfortunate side effects rather than what they truly are: intentional structural components of a profitable model. And yet cracks are forming. Investigative documentaries have gained traction. Journalists have refused to back down. Lawsuits, while rarely successful, have kept pressure on. Some governments like Switzerland and Germany are pushing for mandatory due diligence laws. Activist groups are growing. The public is beginning to connect the dots. But time is running out. The climate crisis threatens cocoa yields. Deforestation, often driven by cocoa expansion, devastates biodiversity. Farmer protests are rising. Global instability grows. And still, the chocolate flows. As we prepare to enter the final chapter of this investigation, we must ask, what now? What does justice look like in a system this vast, this entrenched, this profitable? Is reform even possible? Or is abolition the only moral response? Truth, once known, cannot be unknown. In the final chapter of this story, we confront the question that has haunted every frame, every voice, every revelation. What now? What can be done in the face of an empire so deeply entrenched, so skillfully insulated, so masterful in masking its exploitation behind sweetness? The chocolate industry's crimes are no longer secrets. They are documented, public, prosecutable, and yet they continue. Because knowing is not enough. The real challenge is transformation, systemic, unapologetic, and irrevocable. We begin with the survivors. Their voices are rare, often silenced by shame, fear, or geographic isolation. But some, like Amadou, have spoken out. He was 12 when he was trafficked from Mali into the Ivory Coast, promised a job, promised money. What he found was a forest, a machete, and years of unpaid labor. No school, no letters home, no freedom. Years later, after his escape, Amadou stood in a courtroom in the United States and testified against the companies that profited from his enslavement. He spoke quietly, deliberately, each word a weight. His story was not unique, but it was powerful. Survivors like Amadou don't just want justice, they want change. They want the companies who built billion-dollar brands on their backs to be held accountable. They want a future where children can play in the cocoa fields, not bleed in them. And for that to happen, the systems must be dismantled. One of the first pillars is transparency, not the marketing kind, not the PR gloss, real radical transparency, where every cocoa bean is traceable, every supplier publicly named, every audit independently conducted and verified. This is not science fiction. Blockchain technology, when implemented with integrity, can trace goods from farm to shelf. But it must be mandatory, not optional. auditable, not curated. Next is fair compensation. Farmers must be paid a living income, not survival wages, not token bonuses. A real reliable income that allows them to educate their children, hire labor, legally invest in their land, and break free from the cycle of poverty. This will mean higher prices. It will mean less profit for shareholders. But it will also mean justice. Because poverty is not inevitable. It is engineered. Then comes legal accountability. Voluntary protocols have failed. Certifications have failed. Only binding enforceable law can shift the power balance. This means mandatory due diligence laws at the national and international level, laws that make it illegal for companies to profit from forced labor, even if it occurs halfway across the world. It means legal liability that pierces the veil of supply chains and reaches the boardroom. It means class action lawsuits. It means penalties, reparations, and criminal investigations. Some countries are taking steps. France passed a corporate duty of vigilance law. Germany's Supply Chain Due Diligence Act came into effect in 2023. The EU is finalising its own directive. But these laws are young, underfunded, under-enforced. The chocolate industry is already adapting lobbying and looking for loopholes. It is a race, one between reform and regression. On the front lines of this race are activists. Some are lawyers, some are journalists, some are farmers, some are consumers. They are connected by one belief that profit must never be built on pain. One such activist is Antoinette Kwete in Ghana. She trains cocoa farmers in sustainable, ethical farming and leads community efforts to educate families about the dangers of child labor. Her approach is holistic: increase income, increase awareness, increase resilience. She doesn't wait for Nestlé or Mars to change. She builds change from the ground up. Another is the International Rights Advocates IRA, which continues to fight cases against major chocolate companies in US courts. Despite legal setbacks, they persist. Because legal pressure, even when it fails to convict, forces companies to respond. It creates a record, a paper trail, a timeline of complicity. And then there's you, the consumer, the individual. The shopper standing in front of the candy aisle, faced with a decision that feels both monumental and meaningless. What can one person do? The answer: more than nothing. You can boycott. You can choose certified ethical brands, but demand that they prove their ethics, not just stamp them. You can ask questions, write emails, sign petitions. You can support legislation, donate to grassroots organizations, amplify survivor voices. You can change your habits, not perfectly, but intentionally. Because this isn't just a story about chocolate. It's a story about what we're willing to ignore in pursuit of pleasure, what we normalize in the name of convenience, what we rationalize to avoid discomfort. Every bar of chocolate is a referendum, a quiet vote cast in the economy of conscience. But here's the deeper truth: reforming the chocolate industry isn't just about chocolate. It's about setting a precedent. If we can hold one of the world's most powerful, most beloved, most profitable industries accountable for systemic slavery, then we can do it elsewhere. In coffee, in clothing, in smartphones, in palm oil. This is a prototype, a test case for global ethical reform, and it's far from hopeless. Some small companies are doing it right. They source directly from farms. They pay living wages. They publish their entire supply chain. They operate at smaller margins, slower growth, but greater integrity. They prove that ethical chocolate is possible, that scaling up doesn't have to mean scaling down humanity. The challenge is getting consumers and investors to care enough to shift the balance, because Nestlé won't change out of guilt, Mars won't change out of shame, Hershey won't change because of this documentary. They will only change when doing the right thing becomes more profitable or less risky than continuing the status quo, which is why exposure matters. This film, this story, this data, they matter. Not as an end, but as a beginning. A crack in the armor. A light in the dark. A challenge issued not just to corporations, but to all of us. What are we willing to accept? What are we willing to change? And what do we owe the unseen hands behind our comfort? Because those hands are still at work. Right now, somewhere in the forests of West Africa, a child is waking up. He won't go to school today. He won't play. He won't rest. He'll take his machete walk into the trees and harvest cocoa for someone else's pleasure. He doesn't know your name, but you might know his story now. That knowledge is a burden, but it's also a responsibility. And maybe if enough of us carry it loudly, unapologetically, it will become a weapon. One strong enough to shatter the mask, expose the empire, and finally make chocolate sweet again.